right, hello everybody. We're gonna go ahead and get started. All right. So today's message is an interesting one. On Monday, I read an article about Amir Locke, and I'm not too sure if you guys heard about Amir, but he was a young man, 22 years old, and he was shot and killed by a police officer during what they call a no-knock raid on the apartment where he was staying at the night. And so I watched the video, and apparently the police had released it the day after. And it's a body cam footage. And so what you can see is that the police got a key to the apartment. So they were able to unlock the door and they just opened it. And as they're opening it, at that point is when they're announcing themselves as police. And you see someone who seems to be on the couch with the blanket over their head, and they're kind of startled and moving. And then the video pauses where he's holding the gun, like he has a gun in his hand. And then they shot him, and they paused the video at that point for it being graphic. And so I believe that the police released that video to show that he in fact had a gun, and that they felt threatened, and that they felt the need to shoot him. But then the video that I was watching and the article that I was reading cut into Amir Locke's mother. And in that part of the video, she is asking that the police officer who shot and killed her son, that he be fired. And at that point, I believe that right now the police officer is on administrative leave. And what that means is that he's getting paid, but he's not working while they do their investigation. But the mother of Amir was specifically asking that he be removed from the police force, that he in fact be fired. And as a parent, I can see definitely where she's coming from. And I can see this is going to be a very controversial case, as many officer-involved shootings have been. But the reason why I bring this up is because I wonder how different it would have been if Amir Locke's mother would have appeared on camera and asked that the police officer who shot her son, that he be executed, or that she asked that he be killed in the same way that the officer, killed her son. Now that would be a lot more drastic, wouldn't it? I mean, I think most of us would be like, whoa, that's kind of unreasonable, or hey, we're jumping into conclusions here. Now that wasn't the case here, but it's interesting to just point out to you guys that oftentimes when someone hurts us, or someone hurts someone that we love and that we're close to, often we want revenge. We want that the person who caused us harm, or someone that we love, be punished in the same way that they hurt us or that person. And so that's kind of what today's message is going to center around, about revenge, about getting even. What does the Bible say about that? And what did David do in the situation that he was in? Now, in the Old Testament, and before David's time, it was actually common culture or custom, however you want to say it, for someone to be punished in the same way that they harmed someone else. So for example, Leviticus 24:20 tells us that if someone caused you a fracture, it was a fracture for a fracture. This is where that term comes from that we've all heard of: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then you read right there, it says, the one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. So if you killed someone, guess what? Now we're all gonna have to kill you. If you hurt someone and you sock them in the eye, well, now we're gonna get to sock you as well. If you damage property, now we're gonna get to take your property away. And that's not the only Bible verse that says that, this idea of an eye for an eye. Deuteronomy 19:21 specifically says, show no pity, a life for a life. So if you take a life, we're gonna get to take your life. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. And yet, putting that in context, we're going to see, what did David do when he was faced with King Saul, who at this point we know has been trying to get David killed in so many different ways. And we're going to go right into that. We're going to continue reading the story of David, and then we're going to break it apart afterwards. So let's begin. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 through 22 is where you'll find this. So after Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-gedi. So remember, Jonathan warned him that King Saul really wanted to kill him. And so if you remember, David had to flee. He had to run into the wilderness. Well, now Saul gets word that David is on the run. So verse 2 tells us that Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel, and he went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. And let me see here. Trying to adjust this because you guys are kind of blocking that part right there. Hold on a second. Okay. So we start with verse 3. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. In other words, he goes into this cave and he's got to go restroom. So Saul's going restroom. And as that happened, David and his men were hiding in that same cave. They were just further back. So King Saul didn't even notice. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today, the Lord is telling you that he will certainly put your enemy into your power to do as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. Well, when David did that, his conscience began to bother him because he had cut Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord, the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him." So David restrained his men and he didn't let them kill Saul. See if I can make this a little bit smaller. I'm having trouble seeing the screen. I'm sorry, guys. There.
Yeah, there.
Okay, now I can see them and you guys. After that, Saul had left the cave and he'd gone on his way a little bit. So he was pretty far enough to where David didn't feel he was in danger. David comes out of the cave and he shouts after him, "My Lord, the king." And then Saul turns around, he looks around, and when he does so, David bows down, he bows low before him. Then he shouted to Saul, "Why do you listen to the people who say I'm trying to harm you? This very day you can see with your own eyes it isn't true, for the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave. Some of my own men told me to kill you, but I spared you, for I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one. Look, my father," because remember, King Saul was his father-in-law, "at what I have in my hand. It is a piece of hem of your robe. I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. This proves that I'm not trying to harm you and that I've not sinned against you, even though you've been hunting for me to kill me." Verse 12. "May the Lord judge between us," he tells King Saul. "Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are trying to do to me, but I will never harm you. As that old proverb says, from evil people come evil deeds. So you can be sure I will never harm you. Who is the king of Israel trying to catch anyway? Should he spend his time chasing one who is as worthless as a dead dog or a single flea?" Verse 15, "May the Lord therefore judge which of us is right, and may he punish the guilty one. He," which is talking about God, "is my advocate, and he will rescue me from your power." Verse 16, when David had finished speaking, Saul called back, "Is that really you, my son David?" Then he began to cry. And he said to David, "Oh, you're a better man than I am, for you have repaid me good for evil. Yes, you have been amazingly kind to me today, for when the Lord put me in a place where you could have killed me, you didn't do it. Who else would let his enemy get away when he had him in his power? May the Lord reward you well for the kindness you have shown me today. And now I realize that you are surely going to be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule. And so then he asks David this, verse 21, but now swear to me by the Lord that when that happens, that you will not kill all of my family and destroy my line of descendants. So David promised this to Saul with an oath. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went back to their stronghold, to their camp where they had set up. And yeah, you'd think that the story ends there, right? Happy ending. David doesn't kill King Saul. He lets him go. King Saul is very apologetic. He feels bad. He says, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have been trying to kill you. I'm going to go home now. And he goes home. And yet the story doesn't end there. 1 Samuel chapter 26, which is 2 chapters later, we're going to find that David spares Saul again. What does that mean? That means Saul decides to go after David once again to try to kill him. What I did is I went back. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So I went to 1 Samuel chapter 25. I was like, did David do something? Did he interact with King Saul again that would have caused King Saul to want to kill him again? Or did they have some kind of bad communication, or did something happen? And there's nothing. There's absolutely no communication between David and King Saul from chapter 24 that we just read to this chapter 26. All we know is that chapter 26 starts like this. So some men came from Ziph, came to Saul to tell him David is hiding on the hill of Hakilah, which overlooks this place called Jeshimon. And Saul, just hearing that where David's at, decides again to take 3,000 of Israel's elite troops, not just your average guy. He's going to go and take the top guys to go and hunt David down with his men in the wilderness of Ziph. Verse 3, Saul camped along the road beside the hill of Hakilah near Jeshimon, where David was in fact hiding. When David learned that Saul had come after him again into the wilderness, he decided to send out some spies to verify this report that Saul was in fact there, trying to look for him again. Verse 5, so David slipped over to Saul's camp during the night. They decide to go and check it out, to look around. And Saul and Abner, son of Ner, remember Abner was the commander of his army, as we're told there. So Saul and his commander Abner are sleeping inside a ring formed by all the other slumbering warriors. So you got Saul and Abner sitting, they're laying down, sleeping in the middle, and then you got his soldiers sleeping around just to protect them. And David says, who will volunteer to go in there with me? David asked Ahimelech of the Hittite and Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. I'll go with you, Abishai replied. So David and Abishai decided to go right into Saul's camp, and that's where they found him asleep. So Saul is sleeping there with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. Abner, which is the commander, and the soldiers were lying asleep around King Saul. Verse 8, God has surely handed your enemy over to you this time, Abishai whispered to David. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. Wow, so David now has another chance to kill Saul in his sleep, right? His commander and all his soldiers who are supposed to be protecting him are asleep as well. And his partner, his soldier, is offering to kill King Saul for David. He's like, let me kill him. Let me get him with the spear. One time, I won't even have to strike twice. One time, and I got him for you. And yet David says, no, verse 9. David says, don't kill him. For who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Verse 10, surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he will die of old age or in battle. But the Lord forbid that I should kill the one he has anointed. But instead, let's do this. Take his spear and that jug of water that's beside his head, and then let's get out of here. So they do that. They grab Saul's spear, they grab the jug of water, and they take off. verse 12. So David took the spear and jug of water that were near Saul's head, and then he and Abishai got away without anyone seeing them or even waking up, because the Lord had put Saul's men into this deep sleep. Verse 13, David climbed the hill, goes way up on the hill, opposite of the camp, until he was at a safe distance. And then he shouts down to the soldiers and to the commander, Abner. And he says, "Wake up, Abner." This is David yelling. "Who is it?" Abner demanded. "Well, Abner, you're a great man, aren't you?" David taunted. "Where in all Israel is there anyone as mighty as you? So why haven't you guarded your master, the king, when someone came to kill him? This isn't good at all. I swear by the Lord that you and your men deserve to die because you failed to protect your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around. Where's the king's spear and the jug of water that were beside his head?" Saul recognized David's voice and he called out, "Is that you, my son David?" Again, he says. And David replied, "Yes, my lord, the king. Why are you chasing me?" So here David actually finally confronts Saul head on. He says, "Why are you chasing me? What have I done to you? What is my crime? But now let my lord the king listen to his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, then let him accept my offering. But if this is simply a human scheme, then may those involved be cursed by the Lord. For they have driven me from my home, so I can no longer live among the Lord's people. And they have said, 'Go, worship pagan gods.' Must I die on foreign soil, far from the presence of the Lord? Why has the king of Israel come out to search for a single flea? Why does he hunt me down like a partridge on the mountains?" Verse 21, we see Saul's reaction. Saul confessed, "I have sinned. Come back home, my son, and I will no longer try to harm you, for you valued my life today. I have been a fool and very, very wrong. Here's your spear, O king," David replied. "Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal. And I refuse to kill you, even when the Lord placed you in my power, for you are the Lord's anointed one. Now may the Lord value my life, even as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles." And Saul said to David, "Blessings on you, my son David. You will do many heroic deeds and you will surely succeed." Then David went away and Saul returned back home to the palace. And that concludes our reading for this evening. And now we're going to break it down and look at some of this in more detail. So as we notice here, David chooses not to get even with King Saul, even though he could have, right? Even his own men were telling David to kill him, but yet he spared him. He tells that to King Saul. "For I said, I will never harm the king. He is the Lord's anointed one." And sometimes someone's going to hurt you, or someone's going to harm you, or do something to disappoint you. And you might have a chance to get back at him. And then you will have to make the choice, as David did. It's even possible that your own friends or someone close to you will be like, "Hey, you've got a chance to get back at them. You should do this, or you should say that back to them. And don't let them put you down like that. Say something back, do something." And yet David here didn't let that peer pressure get to him. He knew what was right, and he chose not to hurt King Saul. Instead, what did David do? He leaves King Saul in God's hands for justice to be done. We're going to see that in verse 12. It says, "May the Lord judge between us." This is David talking to King Saul. "May God judge between us. Maybe the Lord will punish you for what you're trying to do to me, but I will never harm you." Then David says, as that old proverb says, "From evil people come evil deeds. So you can be sure I will never harm you." So David's saying, if I harmed you, then that would make me evil, because evil deeds come from evil people. But because I'm not an evil person, you don't have to worry about that. I'm not going to harm you. I'm not going to sink down to your level. Verse 15, though, David doesn't leave it there. He says, "But may the Lord therefore judge which of us is right, and may he punish the guilty one, because God is my advocate and he will rescue me from your power." So even though David doesn't get even with King Saul, even though he doesn't kill him when he had the chance to. He says, I'm not going to do that to you, but I'm going to let God take care of our situation. I'm going to let God be the judge and see who's the real guilty one here. And may God judge us based on that. And he knew King Saul was wrong, absolutely wrong. David did nothing to deserve King Saul to try to kill him. And yet we see that King Saul's reaction to David showing him mercy was what? How did he react? If you remember, it said that King Saul, began to cry, right? It says that he tells David, wow, you're a better man than I am, for you repaid me good for the evil I've done to you. And at that point, it seems like he's really repented. It seems like, wow, King Saul finally gets it. David hasn't done nothing to him. He's going to stop finally. He's going to stop trying to hurt him and kill him. But we see that that didn't last very long. King Saul goes as far to say, may the Lord reward you well for the kindness you've shown me today. And he even acknowledges that David is going to be king. He's like, because you're such a good person, I finally acknowledge that you are going to be the king of Israel and you're going to flourish. Yet, as we saw, King Saul's change of heart doesn't last. And sometimes people that hurt us, after a little bit, realize that they did wrong. And so they come to you and they apologize, right? And they say, I've changed. I'm never going to hurt you like that again. I'm not going to cause any more harm to you. I'm not going to do what I did to you. And so, but like King Saul, that change doesn't last. That repentance that they're showing isn't really genuine. And yet, even though King Saul went after him again, and even though God said was permitted the situation to where David could have killed King Saul again, he stopped his soldier from killing Saul. Verse 9 says, no, David says, don't kill him, for who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Surely the Lord will be the one to strike Saul down someday. Or maybe he'll die from old age or in battle, but me, I'm not going to do nothing to him. And you as my soldier, I don't want you to kill him either. I think something that I want us to focus on, though, is he says, who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? So we already know that King Saul, even though he was the king, God had already left him. He had departed from him. We know, and we're told this in some chapters we read back, that God's presence had come on David, but it had departed from King Saul. And yet David still recognized Saul as being the anointed one, the chosen king. And so for us, when someone does harm to us, when someone hurts us, when someone betrays us, we have to remember, even though this is really, really hard to do, you have to remember that that person is a child of God. You have to remember that that person was made in God's image, and you have to remind yourself that God loves that person. Even though you're upset with them, even though you're hurt by them, even though you feel betrayed by them, it doesn't change the fact that they are a child of God. And so because they're a child of God, you're not entitled to harm them. It's not in your position to get back at them, to get even with them, to hurt them the way they hurt you. Because if you did, you yourself will no longer remain innocent. That's what David says. Who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? If you do harm to the person who harmed you, you're no longer innocent. You're no longer better than the person who did harm to you. And that's where we have to make that difficult decision. That difficult decision to not get back at someone who did you bad or did you wrong. Instead, David, what he does is he trusts in God, that one day King Saul will in fact get what he deserves. And that's the reason why David doesn't feel the need to harm King Saul himself. It's not because he's weak. It's not because David is scared to kill the king. It's because he recognizes that he says, like, I don't have to do nothing. May God strike him down one day. One day he will get what he deserves. Maybe he'll die from old age is what he says right there. Maybe he's going to die in battle. Maybe God himself will strike him. But as for me, I don't got to do nothing. I'm going to let God take care of that person. And that's what we got to do. We got to put the person who hurt us or disappointed us or who harmed us in some way, or someone that we love, we got to trust that God will take care of them for us and that we don't have to do anything back, but just wait. So as we saw, King Saul apologized to David a second time, and he even offers David a chance to return back to the palace. Verse 23 shows us that the Lord gives his, the way David responded was this. When King Saul's like, I'm really sorry, you can come back to the palace. David says this, look, the Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal. He's like, I don't need to go back to the palace. God is going to reward me for the kindness I've shown you. I refuse to kill you even when the Lord placed you in my power, and for you are the Lord's anointed one. But look at this, verse 24, David says, now may the Lord value my life, even if as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles. So another reason too why we don't get even is so that we can trust not only that God's going to take care of that person for us, but we can also trust that God is going to protect you from any future harm, because you have shown mercy to someone who in quote unquote society, you could have gone back at him. You could have gone even, you decided not to take advantage of that opportunity. So although the story of David took place hundreds of years ago, even before Jesus' birth, it's interesting to see how David did exactly what Jesus tells his disciples and the crowds to do when it comes to getting even with someone. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38, 39 is a popular verse that I'm sure people that don't know much about God or church have heard. And this is Jesus when he says this. He says, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And that's that concept of turning the other cheek. When someone hurts you, that we turn the other cheek. And that's easy to say when you haven't experienced deep hurt. It's easy to say turn the other cheek when you're not the one who's suffering from the pain of someone's terrible decisions. And yet Jesus is telling us that's exactly what we need to do. That if someone hurts you, you don't hurt them back. But a lot of times people interpret that as being weak. And they say, well, that's why Christians are weak, because if I hurt you, I know you're not going to do nothing back to me. So I'm just going to keep hurting you. But that's not the case. When someone hurts you and you make the conscious decision not to hurt them back the same way, you're using a lot more self-control. You're showing a lot more maturity than that person who hurt you. And that by far is so much harder to do. Turning the other cheek when someone hits you here and allowing them, turning the other cheek by not hitting them back is what they call counterintuitive. And counterintuitive is a fancy word for not doing what comes natural. If someone hits you, your natural reaction is to hit right back. And yet Jesus telling us don't do that. Because if you do that, if you hit someone and they hit you back, then you're not any different than a non-believer. And yet, I think that sometimes, and this is me personally, you may or may not agree with this. I believe that sometimes turning the other cheek can also mean that you remove yourself from the harmful or toxic situation that you're in. So if someone hits you, they hurt you, you're in a relationship or you're in a friendship or you're at work and someone hits you on the cheek, you turning the other cheek doesn't mean like, hey, go ahead and hit me. I'm going to stay in this relationship. I'm going to allow you to keep hurting me or betraying me or destroying my trust. No, turning the other cheek means, okay, you hit me. Here's my other cheek. And you're going to see it because I'm turning around and I'm walking away. You're seeing this other cheek, not because I'm going to hit you back, but because now you see it because I'm walking away and I'm removing myself from that situation. So turning the other cheek also doesn't mean you continue to stay in a relationship where the person is hurting you. Turning the other cheek doesn't mean you stay in a job where it's like a hostile work environment. And by that, that's a fancy word of saying you don't stay working at a job where you're being mistreated, or you're not being paid as you should, where people are harassing you or being mean to you or bullying you. Turning the other cheek means I'm not going to do it back to you. I'm not going to get even with you. But guess what? Turning the other cheek means I'm going to remove myself from that situation. I'm going to end that relationship. I'm going to get a new job. I'm going to go to a different school. I'm going to switch classes so that I don't have to deal with that situation. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to allow myself to be passive and to be stepped on and to be hurt over and over again. So again, the reason why we don't get revenge on others when we have a chance to, the reason why we don't get back at them isn't because as believers we are weak. No, it's because like David, we trust that God will take care of that person for us. It's because we trust that God will remedy that situation for us. And all we have to do is sit back and trust that in God's time, He will remedy the situation. He will show justice. The person who harmed you will get, in fact, what is coming to them. But I'm not just saying that. You can find this in Romans chapter 12, verse 9. This is Paul writing to the Christians and early believers, and he says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but instead leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay." And this quote right here, "it is mine to avenge, I will repay," you can find that in the Bible, in the Old Testament. You can find that in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 35. So the reason why we don't get back at someone, or we don't clap back on someone who insults us on social media, or why when we find out that someone's been saying stuff about us, we don't turn around and say negative stuff about them, it isn't because we're weak. It's because we can trust that God is taking care of the situation for us. And that if we leave room for God's wrath, He promises to take care of it for us. God says, "It's mine to avenge. I will repay for the harm and the bad things they've done to you." But if we decide to take revenge into our own hands, if we decide to hurt someone, then you cannot allow for God's wrath to take place. You're not allowing God to take care of the situation for you. And of course, things are just going to get worse. So, last thing, I want us to remember this truth, that when tragedy hits, remember this. Romans 12:21 tells us, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And that's hard, because when we're overcome by evil, naturally we want to do evil back to those that have caused us harm. And yet the Bible, the Word of God, is telling us to overcome evil. How do I overcome it? By doing good. And so I put here some examples. For example, do you guys remember a good example of overcoming evil with good was when September 11 happened? That was tragic. It was evil beyond thinking that these people terrorists plan to hijack planes where they had innocent passengers, 200 and something people in like each plane. Just the only harm that they did was they were on their plane traveling, and they decided to fly these planes into these buildings, killing thousands of workers that were working in the trade centers. Evil. And yet, how did we respond? After that evil attack, there were so many people who wanted to help. So many volunteer police officers and firefighters and Marines and just regular citizens flew and went to New York, and they helped dig through the debris in hopes of finding survivors. And they did. They found people, and other people that were living there, other New Yorkers, banded together, and they provided food for these workers, and everyone was working together. And so we saw the good that came out of that. And there was an outpouring of support throughout the whole country. And that's how we overcame that evil with good. Another example would be like a school shooting, and that's just terrible. That's a tragedy. It's just so difficult to explain that. And yet the community, oftentimes you'll see, will come together, and there will be these vigils where people who normally wouldn't even talk to each other in the community are now standing side by side, and they're praying for the family of the victims. They're praying with each other. They're praying for healing. And that's how you overcome evil with good. And finally, going back to the case that we just talked about earlier, Amir Locke, people can come together and they can march for change. They can ask for different changes. And that might look different in different situations, but maybe they say, you know, we need to have this changed procedural, or we need this to happen so that it doesn't happen again. And so people can band together and they can peacefully assemble and they can march and they can ask for changes to be made so that tragedies like the one that happened won't happen again. And so with that, I'd like to conclude that if someone has harmed you, if someone has hurt you or betrayed you, or you're a victim of a crime or a family member, that you don't do what your natural instinct is, which is to harm someone back the same way they harmed you, that we don't do that eye for an eye. Instead, that we show mercy the way David did. And showing mercy doesn't mean you're weak. Instead, what you're doing is you're being stronger. You're reacting in a way that doesn't feel natural. And instead, you're putting that person that hurt you or harmed you in God's hands. And you say, God, I'm gonna let you take care of the situation. I'm gonna let you take care of that person. I'm not gonna take revenge, even if I get opportunity, even if they come so close and I can do right back what they did to me, I'm not going to, because I know that you're gonna take care of it, because you say that vengeance is mine and to leave room for your wrath. And I trust that you will make this situation fair and just, and that sooner or later, because a lot of times we get frustrated, like, why is that person still walking around like nothing? Why hasn't anything happened to him? You have to trust that in God's time, God will avenge you. God will take care of the situation. God will bring justice to that tragedy or tragic situation that you're going through. And so with that, I'd like to conclude and to remember to be different and to follow Jesus's teaching there, to turn the other cheek when someone hits you. And that might mean removing yourself from the situation that you're in, and that's okay. So thank you so much for joining. Thanks for listening to this word. I hope it finds you well. And I hope that God blesses each one of you and that he may protect each one of us. Thank you so much. Have a good night.